general logical reasoning approach, you have the stimulus. The stimulus could either be a fact set or an argument. Fact set stops right there, not a whole lot of nuance, not a whole lot to do beyond that. Typically, this is associated with inference questions, must be true, cannot be true, along with a couple of other types. Weakened questions, of course, will be on the argument side. So either you have a gap or you have no gap. No gap means there is no difference or no space between evidence and conclusion. It's airtight. The evidence guarantees the conclusion 100%, leaving no ambiguity at all. This, of course, rarely happens on the actual LSAT. Actual LSAT arguments typically contain a gap, and that gap can either be a small gap or a big gap. As for how you tell the difference, you don't have to. LSAC decides for you based on the question stem type. So for a weakened question, it would likely be a relatively smaller gap. For necessary assumption, likely a smaller gap. For flaw questions, bigger gap, because we are not giving the arguer or the speaker the benefit of the doubt in that case. So it is not really your job to determine the reasonability or reasonableness of the argument. That's really LSAC telling you how to view it. So that's the good news. The approach. You ID the question type by reading the question stem. You decide, is it a fact set or an argument? If it's a fact set, meaning that inference category oftentimes, you're simply looking to make connections if possible. If it's an argument, determining the reasonability of the argument and engaging in a real-world sense. In many cases, not always, but many times, you can prephrase the answer or use process of elimination. Prephrasing means predicting, so you determine or word or articulate the answer for yourself without even looking at the choices, having a general idea of where it might go, and then you look for LSAC's articulation of the answer in the choices. For weakened questions, you can sometimes, not all the time, it really depends, but it is worth taking a moment to pause and seeing, can you have a general sense of what is one big major way they could potentially weaken the argument? In the absence of that, totally fine, just go through the choices. Now, question stem type, there are approximately 15 different types of logical reasoning questions. It's really important that you know which type you're dealing with. There are usually some really common typical ways they refer to any question type. Sometimes, though, they'll use an unfamiliar or unique wording. Uncommon wordings, break out your thesaurus if you're in doubt, at least while you're studying, and typically you'll be able to figure it out for the future. Now, fact set or argument. Here's one example I threw together. Keisha has brown hair, Janice has blonde hair, Georgette has purple hair. Hair is a filamentous, not sure how to say that, actually, biomaterial that grows from follicles found in the dermis. So is this a fact set or an argument? All right, we got a couple folks, Alyssa, Gabby, Amarachi, all saying fact set, excellent. This is a fact set. There is no argument here. There's no main conclusion, no point they're driving towards, just a bunch of information. Is there any way to even connect things together here? Amarachi saying no. Yeah, I'd say there's nothing immediately that comes to mind. If you really wanted to stretch it, you could say, well, Keisha, Janice, and Georgette all have hair. Therefore, as Alyssa's saying, they all have the filamentous. I'm not going to try and finish that out either. They all possess that biomaterial that grows from follicles, blah, blah, blah. Not the most exciting inference, but technically it is one. Typically, it could just be this alone in an argument, really. And then in that case, they would be paraphrasing things or rewording things in some way. Maybe it would be that really useless connection there, but it could be, okay, well, Janice has blonde hair. What's another way to say that? Janice's hair is relatively lighter than Keisha's hair. That would be one way they could draw out an inference from that. Again, not the most exciting, but technically possible. So we talked about some connections already. If it's an argument, what do we do? So all students applying to law school take the LSAT. Jane is applying to law school. Therefore, she has taken or will take the LSAT. How reasonable is that? Yeah, you're all nodding. Yeah, so it's pretty reasonable. In fact, I would say this is one of those unseen cases on the LSAT where it's airtight. You can't strengthen this. You can't weaken it. It's pretty much perfect. Someone might challenge this and say, well, is it really true that all students applying to law school take the LSAT? Technically, That's not really true. Fewer than 5% of applicants are taking the GRE or going in with one of those really unique rare programs directly from undergrad in rare cases, but the vast majority are taking the LSAT. Now, this stimulus says all. I just pointed out that technically that's not really true. Now, that's evidence, though. That first sentence here in the argument is evidence. So it's not open to question. The fact that our outside knowledge may tell us, well, really, maybe 3% are taking the GRE, 1% are getting special exemptions, doesn't matter. This stimulus said all students applying take the LSAT. So that outside knowledge, throw it out the window. The conclusion is what would be open to question. She has taken or will take the LSAT. And in this argument, which you don't really see on the LSAT, it's airtight. So this is 100% reasonable. But actual LSAT arguments, like, for example, weekend questions, which we'll cover tonight, there are always gaps. There is some space in between, so it's possible to problematize the argument in the stimulus. Now, here's another argument. While at a bar, Jane asked John to watch her bag while she went to the bathroom. When she returned, both John and her bag were gone. Therefore, John stole her bag. How reasonable is this? Alyssa says, not very. Caleb says, not reasonable. Nice. Okay, so what are some potential problems with this argument? What's the gap, or what are some potential gaps or problems with it?
Someone else could have stolen the bag and John could be chasing them.
Yeah, absolutely. That's exactly right. John could be a hero. John could be a great friend, and he's actually helping her out there.
John could have also gone to the bathroom and is still watching the bag.
Yeah, maybe John brought the bag with him to better protect it rather than leaving it alone. As Gabby points out, the argument fails to consider many other reasons for why the bag could be missing. That's excellent. That's a general umbrella that we've got folks giving specific examples. Cora says her bag could be behind the bar and John left. So yeah, maybe John left it with the bartender, who's a trusted friend as well, who's watching the bag there. Could have been somebody else. Yeah, as Majid is saying, many reasons why it could be missing. So yeah, lots of potential problems with this argument. I've given a few here, as I think are pretty much in line with what you all predicted. John met someone else and left, which means he's not really a great friend if he just left it there to be stolen. Or John had an emergency, but he took it with him. So it could have been a bathroom emergency, as someone points out, could have been many other reasons. But yes, there are alternative explanations here. And so these alternative explanations are ways we could weaken that argument. So all of those are ways to weaken this argument. If we want to strengthen it, we could say the opposite of all of that. So maybe we could say, John didn't have an emergency, he just ditched her. John met someone else and just left. So we ask ourselves, does the argument have a big gap or a small gap? Big gap, they're failing to consider a major problem. That's like a flaw question. Small gap, like necessary assumption, the argument simply did not bother to explicitly state. It's all about whether we give the arguer the benefit of the doubt. For a weakened question, we're pushing it towards a bigger gap. So with a flaw question, we're simply identifying the gap in the argument. We're simply articulating it. To weaken it, we're actually exposing or expanding or widening that gap. So fact sets, again, associated typically with inference questions like must be true and most strongly supported. Technically, resolve the paradox would also be a fact set, but you could very easily manipulate it into being an argument. No gap arguments, once again, I can't really think of any examples, but just to be thorough, I'm including that it as a technical possibility. Again, could be with inference questions. Small gap arguments, strengthen, weaken, necessary assumption, sufficient assumption, are generally where it's associated. So generally, I would think of small gap arguments as going in that direction or being associated with that particular question stem type initially, but then if you're weakening it, you could be expanding it. So that small gap, big gap, it's kind of a blurry line there. I don't want you to think of it too strictly. Again, it's all based on perspective, but the question stem is telling you how you might view it. Big gap, flaw's the major one there. Again, pre-phrasing, using process of elimination, predicting, as you all did so well in the chat and over voice as well, some potential ways you could weaken the argument in the stimulus. Thanks for tuning into the show. Please subscribe if you haven't done so already to be notified of new episodes as I release them, and feel free to reach out if you need anything at all as you move forward with your prep. I'm happy to help however I can. In the meantime, I'll wish you all the best and take care.